Welcome, listeners. This is Sanjog Aul, your host, and the topic for our conversation is evaluating Puppet's automation capabilities. And I have with me Nigel Kersten, who is the Chief Technical Strategist with Puppet. Hello, Nigel. How are you?
Good. How are you doing today?
Very good. Thank you. Now, recently, many organizations are very seriously considering digital transformation. And that is also as a possible way to address their next wave of needs or challenges. Puppet is positioning itself as an industry leader in automation and claims that while automation is considered as a key driver for DevOps, if it is leveraged in a holistic manner, can actually be the shortest path to driving changes related to digital transformation with confidence. So we felt it would be very timely and important to find out more about Puppet's automation capabilities. So Nigel, Puppet positions automation as an enabler of digital transformation with so much else that influences the outcome of digital transformation initiatives. How do you justify this connection?
No, that's a really good question. So the way I would tend to look at all of this is I think there's a bunch of reasons why automation, which has been around for quite a while, has really gathered steam once the whole DevOps movement really started picking up, particularly in the enterprise and corporate sector. So the way I always think about DevOps and automation and their relationship is that automation is necessary, but it's not actually sufficient. And so one of the earlier definitions of DevOps was around CAM, culture, automation, measurement, and sharing. And so I think when you actually package all of those things together and you're actually creating cultural change where you're breaking down silos within organizations, you're following a system thinking approach as far as optimizing your whole software delivery lifecycle, from knitting code to testing code to running it in production, once you're actually measuring all of the results of your automation, and once you've instituted a culture of sharing, both within the organization and externally. One of the common things we often talk to people about who are embarking on this journey is that 80 to 90% of what you're doing in IT is really the same as everyone else. And so if you can actually take a lot of the pre-packaged work that we will do either with Puppet, we have existing Puppet modules, and with many of the other tools in this place, try and standardize your operation as much as possible to be aligned with how everyone else is doing it, and then really focus all of your effort on unique differentiators around that. So there's 10% of your infrastructure is actually different to everyone else. But I totally agree that automation by itself is not sufficient to guarantee the success or the outcomes of any digital transformation initiative. But I think this is why we're seeing DevOps really pick up. That when you take a more holistic approach, when you take system thinking, when you do more than just agile, automated infrastructure management, that's where you start seeing much higher rates of success.
Now, to that end, automation, in my view, just enables select IT capabilities. How do you see that enabling innovation or business agility, which is what the business wants today?
Yeah, that's another good question. But I think this has been the other really great sort of aspect of the whole DevOps movement in the enterprise is that for way too long, those of us who worked in operations, in IT, as systems administrators, we really was the trolls under the bridge. You were the cost center, just sitting there, quiet in your cabin, seen as a necessary evil that you just needed to spend money on. There wasn't a lot of connection to actual business value. And I think as we've seen more tech-savvy senior leaders appear in organizations who've grown up with a better understanding of what's actually possible these days, we're seeing both of the senior leadership and an understanding of the strategic import of automation, and that it enables you to ultimately deliver higher quality software faster. But on the flip side, I think the other really great aspect of all this has been that there's now an understanding among people who work in the DevOps space, in operation, that you can't just be more what the business does. But it's not some sort of badge of honor to wear to go, I'm just a technical person who doesn't see business. Really, delivering business value is everyone's job. I think that's been a really amazing mind shift that we've seen among practitioners and team managers, particularly in large organizations, that they care now about what's the actual value being delivered to the business. And I think this both allows them to align their project to be about delivering that actual business value, and it causes them to actually be able to communicate the changes that they're making upwards to their higher management, so that those projects that are delivering business value and enabling the business to be more agile and more innovative get the course, that they get budget year after year, that they're showing a culture of continuous improvement and continuous innovation, And they're going to continue getting funding for that and create that sort of momentum within an organization.
But Nigel, many organizations have already embraced automation and they're also talking about DevOps as part of their IT portfolio. And in many cases, they have actually been reaping the benefits. So what gaps do you think Puppet uniquely positioned to fill?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things. So if you take as a proxy for automation, the whole infrastructure as code movement, that was one of the earlier terms that I'd say 6 or 7 years ago we were being used an awful lot before the DevOps movement started, where there's a few people who offer solutions in that space. So where I think that we're actually uniquely suited is that what we do is we follow very much an infrastructure as code process. So I'm just going to explain that quickly for any listeners who might not understand more. In that rather than just doing automation by creating the series of tasks in a GUI, by having some proprietary system where you might describe automation, bundled as part of the application, what you can do with a tool like Puppet is actually express your infrastructure in a text-based format. And so the clarity is, so you can say, I require that these resources exist and these are the relationships between them, and you actually start modeling your infrastructure. And because it's all in text, you can start taking advantage of decades of learning on the software engineering side, and you can start actually treating your infrastructure with code. You can actually use version control. You can have tagged releases. You can have branches. You can start doing peer review around your code chain. And we know that all of these things resulted in more reliable code, and they're resulting in more reliable infrastructure. I think they're the general benefits of the infrastructure of code space. So where we're uniquely mission to take advantage of both is that we provide an accessible language. You don't need to be a full-time programmer. You don't need to. DevOps isn't about operations people having to become 60 bucks. It's about them understanding the software delivery life cycle and how they can take advantage of software engineering features. We have a very accessible domain-specific language that you use in Puppet that lets you express your infrastructure. And it's accessible to those developers because it feels like working with code. It's also accessible to operations people who perhaps their programming experience has largely been batch script or bash and shell script that they've used to automate small tasks. I think that's one of the really big differentiators. On the flip side, we also have a very robust, but quite rigorous. So when people express their infrastructure in code core using Puppet, we compile that into a catalog that is something that we store historically. That's a state description of that part of the infrastructure at that point in time. So I think what we're seeing increasingly is that the DevOps movement provided all sorts of benefits to our dev and ops teams working together for a common goal. But inside enterprises, particularly in financial services, in retail and healthcare, there are other constraints. And as much as everyone likes to paint the security team with the boogeyman as bad people who just want to say no to everything, there are real reasons why these people exist and why processes and policies exist the way they do. How could we actually provide very strong and rigorous system around reporting of changes that were made, around catalogs and storing what was the state description over time? That allows security team to do things like we discovered that we had a vulnerability in the first week of November last year. Let's go back and see what was the actual state description as that part of the infrastructure. So I think where Puppet's uniquely positioned is that we're both accessible to people who are just embarking on learning programming and the automation journey, but we're also rigorous enough to fulfill the actual business needs around security and compliance.
Now, Puppet also claims the automation solutions it delivers would ensure better enterprise class availability, security, and DevOps compared to the competitors. So what's the basis of this claim? And the other question I have is what has been added or changed in your service that allows you to make this assertion or even strengthen it? And it's a new offering. So if it's new offering, are there any disclaimers?
Yeah, I think along the lines of the stuff I was just talking about around security people really enjoying the ability to validate what production looks like at a point in time. I'd say the other aspect to an infrastructure of code workflow, we've seen this from the DevOps reports that we put out each year, and we just closed and we'll be publishing results in the next few months for 2017, is that you get much better involved. Security are involved earlier in the pipeline. So rather than just security turning into a lull where you have to validate production and run through a checklist and say what ports are open, is this application installed like in this way? Once you've actually done infrastructure code approach and high degree of automation, security can rest with confidence that all of your production instances actually figured the same way. There's no inconsistency across them, which is where we see most vulnerability come from. Most production outages actually come from. And they can get engaged earlier in the design phase. So just as you want your operations people and developers collaboration to better early in the design phase, and when they hit production, in a state that actually works for both teams, we're seeing increasingly security involved in that process as well. So really what we've been working on over the last few years with increased adoption in the enterprise space has been making those interfaces more accessible. So we're not just spitting out a bunch of machine formatted data for those reports, but also making your reporting interfaces much more accessible to people, really improving the speed of answering simple questions about your infrastructure. At the same time, I think we've moved well beyond the point where most enterprises are actually homogeneous environments where there's a single tool. And so because we've been succeeding so well in the enterprise, we're having a lot of people wanting to work with us around integration. How do we actually make the data that we're exposing more visible and available in other decision-making contexts in all sorts of ways? The really big one, I would say, over the last year, though, has been us focusing on giving people the ability to observe the difference between desired change and undesired change. So to go through that, let's say you have your Puppet code with how your infrastructure is meant to work at a single point in time. Then you make a change to that. When Puppet next runs across your whole fleet, a change will come through on all the reports saying this thing changed. And we can draw a whole trail all the way through from this change hit production to this developer operations person invoked that change. So that's the desired change. Undesired changes may be someone did something manually, there's a bad actor on the service, or perhaps there was an unwitting dependency where someone upgraded something and it caused the dependent server to change its version when no one actually wanted it to. That's an undesired change. So we've been really focused on making that available through APIs and through data, but also in interface. So you can look at your infrastructure as you glance and go, what are these changes that are going on? Are they bad things that are being repeatedly undone? Or is this just a sign of my team working in an agile manner and actually pushing what the changes through?
So Puppet is still a third party. And when it comes to the customer security, when you're dealing with mission critical data systems or applications, you have different and evolving expectations. So how much security that we have to incorporate in it? And are you actually well prepared to match up to all those expectations that those decision makers may have at any given point?
So I think this is something where we've always had a big advantage versus our competitors, but there's a little bit more work to get going with Puppet because we use SSL clients to just verify all of the endpoint, the wallet, the active services, the people connected. We've always had a very strong and rigorous secure approach. I think being quite lucky that when I first joined Puppet, and I think 14 or 15 people 7 years ago, and now we're getting close to 550, we had a lot of people who'd been in security role. Various organizations. We had people that had come from banks in Australia and worked at Google, closely in security teams. We had people from the Caterpillar. We've had a lot of people who've had to actually build security in the enterprise. And so we all had a pretty good understanding of what are you actually looking for from a vendor? And ultimately, I think it all comes down to you're looking for transparency, you're looking for speed of response, and you're looking for a good trail around how have you actually handled security issues in the past. So if you go to our website and you go to puppet.com/security, you'll actually see how we've handled all of our CVE. They actually follow most of the standards around tagging CVE, the severity. And honestly, most enterprises are in such a terrible state when it comes to security. Not through the fault of any of the security team, but just because they're not automated, there's lots of silos, hard to get visibility across everything. That once we actually showed them how much we could take security seriously, and we talk about the secure architecture within Puppet, usually the security people are the people most clamoring to actually adopt our tool.
If you look at the enterprise IT needs that you may have, the obvious ones, of course, there would be reasons why people chose automation and it's thriving and it's creating value. Are there any not so obvious enterprise IT needs that automation solves? And perhaps we should also look at places where automation could be an overkill. So are there areas where automation would be an overkill? So if you were a customer and trying to calculate ROI for automation, would you say that ROI will be all in hard dollars, or would you see them primarily mostly being in soft benefits?
So I think there's a few things there to unpack. And I generally, and I would say this because I come from the automation space, and even before I started at Puppet, I was one of those people who was a very strong proponent of automating absolutely everything. Even if you've only got one server running a given service, it's worth automating, not just because of scale, not just because of speed and deploying features, but what's your disaster recovery strategy? Would you rather have someone have to follow a checklist and set up a whole block by hand? Or would you rather just be able to deploy another instance? What's your plan when you actually need to scale out that kicking or further? So I think there's very few spots where automation is actually overkill. Sometimes there's a degree of investment in automation. So a good example I would say is a lot of legacy systems. A myth we often run into when we're talking to enterprises is that they're working on their greenfield deployments. They actually want to follow modern principles around but they don't actually think that there's huge benefit in investing in automation for their legacy. But sometimes a really small investment can actually have a really huge impact. So an example I would say would be look at your foundational layer. Look at things like time synchronization across your fleet. How often are you running into authentication issues? How often are you having trouble actually investigating and doing forensics around security issues because log timestamps are out of whack? The very simple things like ensuring all of the servers are synchronized in terms of time, ensuring your authentication credential, that you don't have stale ones sitting around, you have up-to-date processes for automating the delivery of credentials onto machines and access control. Very simple things like that can actually have a really huge win. And one story I often tell people about is a customer who had over 12 instances of a legacy application, and they just decided they weren't going to bother automating it. And then someone had some spare time, and all they did was take all of the configuration files for that kernel and check them all into version control. Then they set up simple automations to deliver those config files onto the boxes. But this is a pretty simple process. In Puppet, it takes you 2 or 3 minutes to actually define a file resource to say, grab this file and deploy it as the config file. If it changes, restart the servers. The heavily change processes sped up an awful lot. But perhaps more importantly, I got a whole bunch of insights and looked at things and went, look, we've got 12 servers, we're almost all exactly the same. Yet we have 10 different variations in this config file. So by simplifying that process, they suddenly actually freed up a whole bunch of time every time they did an upgrade, because services would automatically restart when they pushed a new config file. We actually reduce differences and inconsistency between the. That's my general answer for whether there's any place where automation would be overkill. I think it's very rarely is there overkill in automation. You can get to a point where sometimes there's one step in the process that's going to require manual verification anyway, and it's not worth spending 3 or 4 weeks for some particularly intractable service within automate. Now, as far as calculating ROI for automation, I mean, ultimately you've got to come back to what are your actual business goals? And usually they rest upon increasing speed and delivery and increasing quality at the same time and reducing your defect rate. So increasing speed both for delivering new features and from recovering from failure. So once you're actually measuring both things, I think that's how you actually calculate your ROI for automation. So whether that's in hard dollars or soft benefits, I think depends upon your business goal, but most people should be able to get to a position where they can actually quantify in hard dollars what is the actual cost of this service being down and what's the cost in terms of people time, babysitting his service and managing it all by hand.
Let's take a quick break. Listeners, will be right back after these messages and talk about if automation is taken all the way. The more you automate, which is what I'm saying, the more risk it could create in terms of, say, the cascading issues if something goes wrong, and that could potentially offset the ROI you might be looking at with respect to automation. So what is Puppet done to prevent something like that from happening with its automation suite? Please stay tuned, listeners. We'll be right back.
Today, enterprise technology is both strategic and global. Each week on CTN CIO Talk Network, IT thought leaders from around the world share their experience with listeners as they discuss with Sanjog Aul how they are trimming costs and partnering with business to innovate and help IT become more competitive, better care for customers, and improve the corporate bottom line. If you want to keep up with IT thought leadership, listen to CTN CIO Talk Network with Sanjog Aul at CIOTalkNetwork.com. This is CTN Solution Spotlight on CIO Talk Network.
Welcome back. So, Nigel, more we automate, the more risk it could create. And that could be a perceived risk, or maybe it could become reality if it's not handled properly. So, does Puppet have anything in its suite the automation suite so that we don't have this issue would potentially offset the very ROI that you were looking for in the first place?
Yeah, no, I think I want to challenge some of the premises in that question, but I feel like there is a cathedral sometimes in automation where people go, if we let the robots control everything, we're going to suddenly end up in a Terminator zone. But I think the reality is for most environments that currently they're undergoing an unknown amount of risk. They don't actually have great insight with what their infrastructure is actually doing, and they need to be comfortable with that. And they need to use to a world where customers will cause an issue, whether they be internal or external, and gets escalated to a service desk, and someone scrambles and wakes up at 2 a.m. and they're doing the whole Hillary process is fixing it in 20 minutes before they'll have to murders. But often that's not actually a great, well-quantified risk. And I think we've seen most of the data from the security industry has shown that the biggest security risk for most companies is actually in terms of inconsistency in production environment. I think when you categorize that at a whole business overview perspective, the biggest risk for most companies is actually in terms of overall service availability, being able to ship new features, because in many cases, shipping a new feature is the same process as applying a security fix that from a vendor, and their overall security posture. I think the biggest risk for those is actually the inconsistency caused by manual deployment. And yes, there is the risk, and I've laid this joke before I joined Puppet, that when I was at Google, Puppet was one of the tools that you break more servers at once than anything else I'd ever come across. But the reality is we have an awful lot of tooling around Puppet, and that you can do a simulation run where you can actually, in no-op mode, run Puppet and it will code the changes that are actually going to happen. But rather than actually having the important processes that most enterprises would have to reduce risk, where they'll have it on checklist, they will require to sign off by 25 different people, so that when it inevitably breaks down, no one person is actually to blame because they all are to blame. What we see is double down on your automation. Double down on automating your test environment. We know how this works with software. People didn't start writing less code to get their application working more reliably. They started building infrastructure around it. They started doing unit tests, credit tests, automated CI pipeline, continuous delivery. So the biggest thing we see, get people to adopt automation, get them to adopt a whole bunch of software engineering principles, not being afraid of actually sharing post-mortem internally about when things went actually wrong. We'll build a fully automated solution. We can actually test changes before they go to production. This is actually, I think, one of the biggest benefits of an automated environment, that your production environment and your dev, test, UAT environment can all be exactly the same. A number of times we've talked to enterprises who are adopting our tooling entirely because of a major outage caused by the fact that their testing environment weren't anything like their production. But the more you can equip self-service around this, where developers can actually run something that looks exactly like production, you develop the code on, your QA and QE teams are testing codes in exactly the same way as this works in production, you're minimizing risk, particularly if you're adopting agile-based work in small chunks. More changes are happening more frequently, reduces risk more than any.
And when you see a perceived lack of control and visibility, which could very well happen when we are talking in automation, then folks might have security concerns. So do you have something in your architecture and the controls that you put in your solution suite, which will automatically lead itself to higher visibility and in turn allowing people the flexibility to enable security in such a way so you can claim that if you put Puppet's automation solution, it's going to result in secure operation?
Yeah, I think this is where you come back to the whole infrastructure of code approach and involving security in the design phase, rather than just validating production, or indeed being a bottleneck and a gateway for code being shipped to production. Once you actually have a decent contract between the security application operation people, they can actually all collaborate inside the same code repo. They can actually verify changes before they hit production. Then your security people can end up having the same kind of access to self-service environment your developers and operations people are. And the contract goes all the way. I think one of the biggest frustrations we see amongst operations people is when they just get handed a tarball or a zip file of code and get this is the thing that needs to be deployed to production. Contract we often see the worst anyway is for your application developers to go, no, we're going to package all of our code. You're going to produce offer NFIs, RPM, or DEM, whatever package format you're using for your platform. So that on the application side, we can guarantee this is the payload that should be there. On the operation side, they can go, here in infrastructure code form is what the infrastructure is going to look like that's deployed on. And if you open those up to self-service deployment for all of your team, including security, they can actually test those things. In addition, we have a whole bunch of features in Puppet that let you do things like tag certain resources as being particularly sensitive. If you perhaps modifying user access control or firewall configuration or FE Linux for any of those sorts of things into security posture, security teams can get a report on those. You can do that before you actually hit production. Through a standard software development lifecycle, having dev, test, and code, you can also have changes that are impacting security. Either require code review by your security team or come into just the automatically entry report.
So when we look at Puppet, and of course, the way the marketplace is changing and new environments are getting created or there is creative destruction happening, what is Puppet doing to learn and innovate in these areas and differentiate from automation solution providers? So if someone has to really buy a solution or basically adopt a solution, they want to at least know that you are a thought leader and a go-to resource. So what are you doing? What's Puppet doing to become that go-to resource, that thought leader in the automation space?
I would definitely argue we're already the market leader in what Gartner called the continuous configuration automation space, where we've been steadily stealing deployments on the BMCs, the Blade Logic, HP service automation. People who are moving towards the new world are adopting a tool like Puppet. And if the people adopting a tool like Puppet, most of them are actually adopting Puppet. I'd say we're definitely already the market leader negotially for in the enterprise DevOps automation space. But one of the things that backed that up was our publishing of the DevOps report each year. So we partner with people who, the listener may have heard of, Gene Kim, who was CTO of Tripwire, and wrote the Phoenix Project, which is a DevOps enterprise story in novel form. Des Humble, who was one of the authors of the continuous delivery and lean enterprise space. And Dr. Nicole Fulgrim, who's been a researcher working in the field of IT organization on the scale of DevOps time. I have a company called DevOps Research and Assessment, and we partner with them on doing the Fate of DevOps report each year. And we're seeing increasingly, that's the sort of information that's in business leaders available. What we do there is we actually survey a whole bunch of practitioners and ask them about their practices, how their organization works. But we also ask them a bunch of metrics. How long does it take you to recover from failure? How often do you have failure? How often do you promote changes? And then using statistical analysis, we've been able to show every year that people separate into different classes. People adopting DevOps practices or tooling and achieving significantly higher IT performance. Over the years, there's a bunch of really interesting analysis on that, showing that companies who are adopting these processes turn out to be higher performing IT organizations, and it has this really concrete impact both in the bottom line and the level to which they achieve internal goals.
So
I would say the fact that we're increasingly focused on integrations with other components of the DevOps enterprise tool chain as it emerges, it will also find that we've definitely become a market leader.
when you look at digital transformation, that's the end, and say the automation and DevOps are the means. So with that, that a means to an end approach, and where digital transformation itself is evolving. So what do you think when we are looking at the developing areas where they are evolving, and basically we are not there yet? That means you may not really be having all elements for the future ready, because you don't have a crystal ball either. So what would you say your solution doesn't have, because it does a lot of things what it doesn't do?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So I think if you look at the adoption curve of Puppet and Puppet Enterprise in this phase, we were very much at the bleeding or hemorrhaging edge of the market. It was very early adopting the entirely in a sort of textual interface. But we've been crossing the chasm for a while now, and we're being pulled into more enterprise environments, but people have a requirement around visibility, around multi-tenancies, and particularly the out-of-the-box experience. And so I think we've been very much focused on the out-of-the-box experience when developing an operations book. But the last few years have really seen increased interest on the security side. But we haven't yet solved all of the out-of-the-box requirements of security teams in a DevOps role. And I think you're going to see us continuing to focus on that space, where we're giving more, let's get you 80% of the way through to your HIPAA, your SOC, your PCI DSS, those sort of compliant family, where people are really looking for a really short time value. So in short, I'd say just more out of the box experience and making tooling even more acceptable.
Let's talk about the very big question that everyone wants to get a good answer to, which is how should an enterprise go about selecting an automation solutions provider And since you know that you cannot be the provider to everyone out there in the world, how would you basically guide and mentor the prospects and the customer or a bigger enterprise decision-making leadership out there? How do they go about picking it up and how they could best use automation and also, as you mentioned, DevOps towards meeting that end goal of driving change with confidence when it comes to changes that you want to make for digital transformation?
Yeah, no, that's the really big question, isn't it? So I think in general, the approach you want to take, and we're seeing sort of senior business leaders take quite seriously, is that you want to make sure you're making a globally optimized decision, not just a locally optimized one. It can be very even to make one team within your organization, say, take a kind spot and dictate tooling to all of the other team. But it's important to make sure that you're taking into account the needs of all of your people, your application developers, your operations staff, and your security team. But also, and this might sound odd in all the enterprise environments, are you taking into account the needs of your management chain? Because one of the biggest improvements to velocity we see amongst all of these groups is where you have a tool that lets the management have the kind of reporting they actually need without having to actually ask for it. So I think this is where self-service comes off a whole bunch of different domains. Are you picking a tool that will actually get you? Because too often we see software just sitting on the shelf and get renewed year after year and no one has any idea if it's not actually being deployed. So make sure it's a tool that people actually enjoy using and that the user experience is actually good. And that you've defined a common interface across all of your teams. So I think there's a few things there that the future is pretty uncertain, I think, in terms of infrastructure. We're seeing change happen faster and to a greater degree than we've seen, I think, ever. We're only seeing acceleration, the adoption of public cloud and containers and serverless architectures and all of these things are hugely disruptive to traditional ways of working. And no one really knows where it's all going to go. I think if you said 10 years ago that a bookseller was going to become the biggest provider of infrastructure in the world, it would have been difficult to actually tear into your crystal ball and see that. So I think you want to focus on a few things. You want to look for vendors who both had experience managing that sort of change and have been around for more than a cycle or so. So you're looking for people who have open APIs and interfaces and you can integrate with the rest of your team. Because I think the time has really passed for enterprises to just adopt one vendor and to say, we're entirely a Microsoft shop or we're entirely a Cisco shop or an EMP shop. We're seeing people picking best and breed tooling to build out their tool chain. And that's going to change over time. You're looking for a tool that has open APIs and integration points, and that has a wide degree and variety of partners that they're actually integrating, so that they can continue the momentum as the rest of the world changes. Ultimately, I think I would sum all that up in, are you picking a tool that is actually capable of being a bridge to the future? Can it manage all of the infrastructure you have now? And do they actually have their eyes on where things are going? And do they look like they're actually going to be ready for dealing with the disruptive change that
Once again, thank you, Nigel, for sharing your thoughts and insights in our Solution Spotlight segment.
No problem. Thank you for having me on.
And listeners, I invite you to find the related conversations on our website at CIOTalkNetwork.com.